Hey guys! Today I want to do a brief showcase of the Asura for the Male Slayer class, now that we finally received this renewal. I'll be covering things like general playstyle, tips and tricks for some notable skills, talisman recommendations, some example rotations, and a few gearing guidelines for endgame optimization. Asura is an extremely grounded and versatile magic damage dealer and deals fixed damage, meaning he scales with intelligence and independent attack. So you'll want to refine your weapon and not reinforce it. Let's just jump straight to skills. First off, I want to talk about his buff, Murderous Wave. You'll see this pulsating energy around me. When it's actually activated, it actually has a sound effect and happens a little bit more frequently. Ultimately, this is just a damage buff, but it also does damage. So you'll see enemies in range will take damage. But this actually leads me into my next skill, which is Thunder God Energy, your second awakening passive, right here. And ultimately, Thunder God Energy is just a passive damage buff, but it also zaps enemies nearby, just at intervals, and it does actually a decent amount of damage. It's pretty considerable, actually. But this will only happen if Murderous Wave is active, as you can see. As soon as I turn this off, if I toggle my Murderous Wave, now it no longer deals a damage aura, but it also does not do the zaps either. And this is great for when you need to get counters, or if you need to time your attacks for something, or if you just need to stop doing damage because of a reflect gimmick, or you don't want to kill a boss, etc. Next I want to talk about Wave Wheel Slasher, and this is actually pretty cool because this is just a basic Male Slayer class skill. But for Asura, now it grabs ungrabbable enemies as well, and you do get the iframes. And this is relatively new, but this is incredibly useful for survivability, and even if you can't grab them, as long as you connect the skill, you can see the white outline around my body, I am iframed with the skill. But keep in mind that it does have to connect still. If you just raw cast it, nothing happens, no super armor, no iframes, nothing. So if there's enough latency or enough lag in the party, this can absolutely whiff, and it still can get you killed, but ultimately it's probably worth trying. A very, very, very short animation. Next, Wave Radiation, specifically after your third awakening. Wave Radiation normally is just this AoE, and it will actually push enemies into the direction you're facing. However, if you get your third awakening passive at level 100, now it becomes a dash, or rather can be used as a dash. If you hold a direction, left, right, you can perform this dash while also performing the shockwave, and the range is deceptively large. So absolutely use this to get out of the way if you need another dash instead of just drive slash. But also you can use this for damage and repositioning as well, like this. Next, Spirit Crescent. This is just a normal skill that you just cast. However, when you do not have the Asura Spirit Crescent passive, it is just this skill right here, very, very tiny wave. But as soon as you get the Spirit Crescent passive leveled, now it becomes a charge skill. You hold it down, charge it, and then let it go. But once you get your third awakening passive, Spirit Crescent now is always cast in the fully charged form. And you can charge it now, but there's just no reason to. One other thing about Spirit Crescent, though, is that you can actually cancel into it from your wave skills. Ice Wave, Fire Wave, Glacial Wave, and Magma Wave can all cancel to Spirit Crescent, and it'll very fluidly flow into it. And you can kind of buffer into it, too. You don't have to, cast it, on the frame after your skill. Pretty nice. You don't have to use it this way, just because, after Third Awakening it's fast enough anyway. But it does remove a little bit of the post-cast delay on some skills. And now, I want to talk about Ground Quaker, which was recently reworked. Before, this was a fully channeled ability, and the only way to get rid of the channel was to use Deadly Enticer right after it. But now, it is not a channeled ability. Now you just land it, and you are free. As soon as you connect with it, that's it. And now the damage is incredibly high, the DPS is very high. This is an incredible skill to use, and the Talisman is absolutely going to be worth it for damage output. But also, you can still, as you can see, chain it into Deadly Enticer if you'd like. You'll see all the skills are grayed out, but after I use Ground Quaker, Deadly Enticer is going to be lit up. And also, when you're casting Deadly Enticer, you'll see Agni Pentacle is also lit up. You can absolutely use all three of these skills in quick succession like this, very, very fluidly. The only downside is that Agni Pentacle does have quite a long channel, and the damage is just okay. It is much better now. I personally don't really like this version. I really liked it when it was circling your character. Ultimately, this is pretty nice. Deadly Enticer, by the way, has also been changed, as you can see. It is no longer centered on the character himself. It is now in front of him, and it does still suction enemies to the center. And just like before, you do have to press the attack key or the skill key again to perform the finisher sooner. Otherwise, it has a very, very long animation. Next, I want to talk about Magma Wave Sword, which was also reworked. And ultimately, this is not a huge change. It does not really change the way you use it. It's just still a super hold. But now there's a delayed finisher explosion at the end, and it does look really cool. The damage was buffed a little bit, but ultimately the DPS is still on the lower side, as it does have a very, very high cooldown now. Some people do use this with the Talisman even, and the TP. Personally, I do not. I only use this for utility and just filler skills. Up to you, ultimately. Next, I want to talk about Indra. This one doesn't really need too much of an explanation. You just cast a skill, it does a damage over time, and then it explodes after a short duration. If you have multiple enemies, there is this cool chain lightning effect with the sound effect. Pretty cool. Doesn't really ultimately do anything, technically speaking, unless there are more enemies that were not hit by it. But I do want to add that if you press the skill key again, it'll perform the finisher right away. Obviously, it does less damage this way, but if you know for sure the boss is going to go away and become iframed or whatever, you can just manually explode and detonate the finisher. But generally speaking, it's kind of whatever. Next, I want to talk about his probably most important skill, Heavenly Vajra. This summons a thundercloud, and basically, whenever you attack enemies with your Murderous Wave active, it'll shoot out these little lightning swords at the enemy that you hit. And as you can see, the zap from my Thunder God energy is proccing the Thunder Swords. But if I'm attacking this enemy as well, this will work just fine as well. And it's basically free passive damage. But you'll see it does have a duration and a cooldown. Now, when this remaining time, this duration goes away, this skill will just poof, it'll just vanish. As you can clearly see in 5 seconds. And it's gone. And it just goes away. However, if you summon Thundercloud and then actually do this input again, or just press the skill key again, what'll happen is it'll perform this finisher, this multi-hit into a large sword finisher right in front of you. And always in front. However, this does mean the Thundercloud does go away, so then you lose the passive damage. And this seems kind of annoying at first glance, because now you have to kind of manage the cooldown of the skill as well as the duration, and you have to specifically look for openings. But this is going to be a complete non-issue once you get the Talisman for it, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Next I want to talk about Wave Eye, his first awakening, which is a transformation awakening, and you'll see that it actually replaces his wave skills with new attacks. Neutral Wave, Ice Wave, and Fire Wave. And Neutral Wave is this wing flap that actually gathers enemies and puts them on the same x-axis, roughly, on a very low cooldown. The DPS is kinda low, but it's not bad. But it's great utility and will gather enemies for you. Your Ice Wave is a shock wave that actually pulls enemies towards you. And this can be absolutely useful for gathering enemies together. You can chain these together like this and, you know, do all kinds of things. And of course you have Fire Wave, which shoots out these spears. And this actually does a pretty substantial amount of DPS on a relatively low cooldown. But ultimately, the most important thing as far as DPS goes for Wave Eye is your basic attack string, which gets this spinning wheel added to it. That does a pretty good amount of DPS. But the problem with this is that obviously you have to finish your basic attack string and you have to stay on top of the enemy. It does have a very, specific range. If you use it like over here, it's not going to do the full damage. If you have to be like over here to get all the multi-hits in. And this can take some getting used to, and ultimately you can absolutely just get punched in the face or swatted aside, or ultimately killed if you're not careful with this, if you get too greedy. So do be careful. But you can absolutely do things like this and just cancel into skills with this ability, and it'll flow relatively well, especially during a DPS phase. Pretty cool. And of course the finisher, as you have already seen, is this nearly screen wide finisher. Does a lot of damage actually. It's pretty cool. But this will automatically happen if the awakening expires, and this is actually a problem for one very big reason, that being that your third awakening can only be cast while you are in your first awakening if they are linked together. For example, if Wave Eye finishes, you'll see now my third awakening is grayed out. I can no longer cast a skill. I have to be in Wave Eye to perform my third awakening. And this could be a problem. If you cast Wave Eye because you think that it's going to be a DPS phase, and something goes wrong, maybe, the boss decides that he's not gonna do whatever he's supposed to do, or maybe he's doing something a little bit later than usual, or maybe later than you expect. And now you can't perform your third awakening, and then first awakening expires. Now you are locked out of using your third awakening until you can recast your first awakening again. And that's kind of annoying. So therefore, generally speaking, if you're trying to use your third awakening, assuming you don't have any cooldown swaps, I would not stay in this transform mode for very long and just go straight into your third awakening at an opportune time. Just get your damage in. The class does a great amount of DPS without your awakening already, and that's fine. Now you can have access to things like Ice Wave and Fire Wave again, and they do a lot of damage. Alright, next I want to move on to Talismans. We'll start with Deadly Enticer. Deadly Enticer is actually really cool because now, instead of channeling the entire ability, when you cast a skill, it will automatically perform the rest of the ability itself. So now you can just install it and just move around. This is actually completely viable and pretty strong, actually. The one downside is that there is kind of a bit of a delay before the finisher can happen. So you can't just perform the finisher immediately yourself, you just have to wait for it to explode. And it could, in theory, miss, but the range is quite large, as you can see with the Talisman. It's probably going to land. Next I want to talk about Agni Pentacle, skipping Ground Quaker for now. And Agni Pentacle doesn't really do anything crazy. It does make the skill faster and much larger. It is ultimately very, very strong. But the main problem is that it is still a fully channeled ability and it can be risky to use even at this speed. And the range is kind of interesting. It is very much in front of you. If you don't mind that, feel free to use it. More power to you. And next I want to talk about Glacial Wave Sword, which I do have the Talisman for equipped. And this is kind of crazy for a couple reasons. What this allows you to do is you can press a skill key again and automatically detonate all the ice pillars that you throw out. So all these pillars, if you press a skill again, they just all explode. And the cool part about this is that the super hold will actually linger. So just because I explode does not mean the enemy is no longer held. As you can see, if I use it on Nugol here, if I use Glacial Wave Sword and perform the finisher, he is still super held for the entire duration. And this is actually very, very nice for room clearing and also just DPS. And this is quite popular as a third talisman. Next I want to talk about this most important talisman, Heavenly Vajra, which I alluded to before. And now you'll see at the first line says, the lightning cloud lasts indefinitely. And this is amazing. Now when you cast a skill, it does not go on cooldown, as you can see. And the duration is infinite, as it has very clearly said. But on top of that, now if you perform the skill again, you'll see that it immediately tracks the strongest enemy. So for example, if I have multiple enemies here, and then say I have a boss enemy right in the center, and now you'll see when I cast a skill, it'll automatically target the boss sandbag and not the other ones to perform the finisher, and it is immediate. The lightning cloud does not move over, it just generates a brand new one, and this one does not go away. You do not have to resummon it. It is still going to just keep doing damage, which is incredibly good. And this is absolutely a complete game changer. This makes the skill way more reliable, way easier to use, and it's also very powerful. It is very likely going to be at the top of your charts in every fight. Next I want to talk about Ground Quaker, and this was again completely changed. Before, it used to just have an effect where you could cancel Ground Quaker with Wave Radiation, so you didn't have to channel the entire ability, instead of having to use it with Deadly Enticer. But since they got rid of that completely, all they did with Ground Quaker now is just give it a ton of damage. And so you'll see it says can be cancelled by Wave Radiation, but there is no need to really, because it is immediate. You'll see it is lit up the same as the Enticer, but it is done right away, kind of unnecessary. But you can do things like this, where you can dash ahead, or dash through an enemy even to reposition, and that can be helpful. But you'll also see the range is increased. It also gets a lot of cooldown reduction, and this becomes a just complete DPS powerhouse. Very, very powerful. Actually, the highest damage on paper across all his talismans. And next I want to talk about a personal favorite of mine, Indra. And before, Indra was a damage over time effect with the finisher explosion, but now it is just this gigantic AoE explosion, and this is incredibly strong and very, very effective at just blowing up entire rooms. So if you have multiple enemies, you'll hit everything in that AoE and just do one instance of damage right away. And just for that alone, this is one of my favorite talismans to use. You do not have to use it, but the damage is very, very high per cast. And lastly, Magma Wave Sword did get reworked. I do not have this talisman, unfortunately, but it is kind of cool. Magma Wave right now has this long delay, this super hold, and this finisher. But if you get the talisman for it, it'll actually completely erase the super hold delay and just perform the explosion damage immediately upon use. The damage increase is actually quite high, but again, Magma Wave Sword does have a very high cooldown, and the DPS is absolutely lower than all of his other skills. Generally not recommended, but actually pretty viable now. Completely up to you. Overall, the general recommendations for talismans are Heavenly Vajra and Ground Quaker. These two are just no-brainers, very high DPS, very good utility. And the third slot can be whatever you want. Indra is my choice. Some people like to go Glacial Wave Sword. I have seen people use Deadly Enticer for some lower utility as well. Magma Wave Sword is viable, in fact, although the DPS is lower, and Agni Pentacle is okay if you want to use it. Generally not preferred, but all of his talismans are good, through and through. And next I want to show an example rotation with basically no gear, no talismans, nothing. I will give myself extra crit, unlimited HP basic sandbag, 30-second rotation, no consumables, just my buffs. And some key things to note about this rotation, also I will give no speed to myself. There aren't many skills you can use multiple times. The key ones are Ground Quaker, Deadly Enticer, Glacial Wave, Fire Wave, And of course your two main, maybe three main DPS tools, Spirit Crescent, which is very, very high damage. Wave Radiation is just okay, and Ice Wave is either SP dump or you could max it without the TP. It's just okay damage. But all your other skills, Magma Wave, Vajra, and not Vajra, Indra, and the Vajra finisher you can only use once. And because we do not have the Vajra Talisman, we'll be using a Vajra finisher towards the tail end of the rotation. It is fairly quick now, so you can use this with about maybe 8 seconds, 6 seconds left in the rotation, and it'll be fine. So let's do it. So my cloud. Test all these skills I can use multiple times, and from here just press buttons as they come up. Go ahead and transform here. And then go ahead and use my third awakening. Vajra finisher, and just press my abilities again. And the Agni Pentacle to finish it off. Didn't land it, doesn't matter. Doesn't do a lot of damage. And as you can see, it looks something like this. Vajra, absolutely at the top in terms of non-awakening skills. And even compared to second awakening, it is not very far behind. Wave Exchange Blast is quite strong, of course, but having a very high cooldown as well. Ground Quaker, 2 uses. Pretty good DPS. Spirit Crescent, not a cube skill. Use it only 3 times. Very good DPS. Indra, Deadly Enticer, Wave Radiation, Fire Wave is very strong, Glacial Wave, pretty good. That's about it. Very straightforward, not a whole lot going on. You can absolutely do more basic attacks in your first awakening, but honestly, generally not worth the time and effort in actual practical application. And next, I want to show you a rotation with some actual gear. As you can see, I do have a setup here. Very straightforward setup. I'm using Ancient Celebrant with the Mythic, Triangle, Enunciation, Assassin. I'm using a Taiji Emperor Sword. I will be using it the Yang Energy mode, so I'll have the speed penalty. Not going to affect my speed all too much, to be honest with you. Put that on. And I will be using Heavenly Vajra, Intranet, and Ground Quaker Talismans. My runes are kind of all over the place and are customized for my rotations, generally speaking. But it'll make sense. I'll be giving myself 60% attack speed to simulate buffers. 30-second rotation, the same as that. I will be using 3 potions, Undiluted Potion, Mind Stem, and Warlords. And some key things to note about this rotation, of course, is now I can use Vajra twice. It's going to be very tight. Intranet twice. And then Ground Quaker 3 times. I'll also be able to use Deadly Enticer 3 times. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to, but everything else is the same. I will be able to use 3 Fire Swords. I'll be starting my rotation like this. It's going to happen pretty quickly. But the idea is that I want to be able to use my second Fire Wave as soon as it comes off cooldown, and then immediately go into my first awakening and cast my third awakening with almost no hesitation, so I can get my third Fire Wave at the end of the rotation. So it's going to be relatively tight, but overall it's going to be worth it. So let's do it. Oops. You can see that. Not bad. And from that, you will see, with the talismans I'm using right now, Indranet is at the top. Vajra actually did a little bit less damage than I expected, but I think I missed the finisher on the second cast. Ground Quaker did an astounding amount of damage, as you can see. Used it 4 times. Spirit Crescent 4 times, also did a lot of damage. Enticer 3 times, pretty good damage. Fire Wave 3 times, good damage. And now Wave Exchange Blast is all the way down to here. Wave Radiation is just good filler damage, pretty good DPS. Glacial Wave, I don't have the TP past level 1, so it's just filler damage for me as well. And we got a couple Wave Eye basic attack strings in there. Decent damage, I guess. That's all okay. Ice Wave, Magma Wave, and that's about it. Nothing too special. It is kind of involved when you have this much CDR, and I do have like kind of a very specific rune setup here, but you can absolutely play around with this. You can also stack more than one source of CDR. I think that's a little bit overkill just because of how his kit works, and he has a lot of low cooldown skills already. But that's alright. And so let me go into equipment now and just general gear guidelines. Taiji weapon is, generally speaking, gonna be his best in slot weapon. It's got a lot of skill attack with Yang energy, but it does have a speed penalty. The good part is, casting speed is something he has a lot of. Wave Manifestation Brand gives me 90% casting speed at level 20. That is a lot. And you can recast this too, and give yourself a little bit more casting speed if you have plus levels from like Enunciation, a little bit extra. And so the penalty on Taiji is very, very negligible for casting, as you can see. He has no trouble. However, movement speed is a totally different story. You will be moving much slower with Taiji, especially if you don't have things like, you know, Enunciation or Celebrant to give you more speed. And now you're just this turtle. And this can absolutely be dangerous. Having a setup that gives you movement speed and attack speed is absolutely key. Attack speed is a little bit less important now that you don't really have to basic attack very often. Especially for Wave Eye, it's kind of whatever now. Generally, you just go straight into your Third Awakening. But it can be helpful still. That said, Caliburn is also technically viable. I don't necessarily recommend it. Short swords are not really any different from katanas. They do actually have lower intelligence and lower attack speed, so katana is generally the way to go, despite Taiji having the penalty. Avant-Garde is actually quite good too. It's got way more speed, and does not have a speed penalty, more so. And the damage is pretty comparable. It's not as strong, obviously, but the speed will kind of make up for it. Definitely don't use bludgeons. Zambatos are actually kind of good. Deus Imagery is actually quite effective, especially if you have a setup that doesn't have a lot of elemental damage. And the main thing is that if you're using Taiji, generally speaking, you don't want to use something like War God's Mythic, because War God's 3-piece has a scaling bonus based on movement speed, and you're not going to have a lot of movement speed with Taiji. Therefore, Deus Imagery is actually going to be a much better option, but of course you can just use Avant-Garde or Caliburn instead. I don't really recommend Ingrid Vidil, as it kind of has the same modifiers as Caliburn, but is more focused on bonus damage, whereas this one is a little bit more spread out. So Caliburn is usually going to be better in almost every scenario. But that's about that. Kashima Zambato is viable. It has some cooldown reduction and some speed, despite being a Zambato, and the damage is going to be lower. That CDR can help you, but I think it's probably overkill, especially since you can just get Assassin 3-piece from Sirocco, and that's all the CDR you really need. While on the topic of Sirocco, I also want to talk about Gatekeeper. And Gatekeeper is absolutely viable. He does light damage by default. As you can see, I do not have an element inflict, but if I hit an enemy, I do actually do light damage. So he does not need an inflict. But he's also not element locked. He does not gain elemental damage from any of his passives, etc. So Gatekeeper is absolutely viable for just raw elemental damage through and through, but it is going to be relatively expensive, as you will probably want all elemental damage and chance. And next, of course, you have Rhodos, and Rhodos is not a terrible idea. If you're using Taiji and you don't really have any speed whatsoever, but you might have some cooldown reduction already, or you might not have a need for cooldown reduction, Rhodos is actually quite viable. You will be doing a little bit less damage, but the utility is very nice. You get a ramping up attack speed and movement speed bonus as you attack and dash, and you also get permanent super armor, and every 10 or so seconds, as long as you don't get hit, you will actually get a burst 30% heal. That's quite nice to have. And of course we have Nex, which is also a pretty decent setup, slightly stronger than Rhodos. It's a more budget-friendly all-rounder that just gives 5% modifiers across the board. If you already have enough CDR or don't need it, this is absolutely a fantastic choice. Very underrated. But generally speaking, it's not going to be a best-in-slot setup. And then we have, of course, Roxy. And Roxy is just okay in my opinion. A lot of his damage comes from his Talisman skills, from his Vajra, his Spirit Crescents, etc. And his Awakenings are kind of just decent at best. However, there is one spec where this actually does shine, and that's if you have cooldown reduction for your first Awakening. And as you can see, I have 3-piece Mana Vortex with the Product of Wisdom sub-equipment, so this is level 100, and the Time Traveler Bracelet. And now my first Awakening has a 68.5 second cooldown, but if I manual it, you'll see it has a 65 second cooldown. And this is a 40 second duration Awakening. I have about 75% uptime on this thing. And this is actually incredibly high DPS, and you get just unlimited wave wheels almost. And these wave wheels are in fact affected by Roxy's 17% first Awakening damage for each piece. And this can actually be a very viable DPS setup. However, in the current meta of both Osmo Raid and to an extent Sirocco Hard Mode and Black Purgatory on higher difficulties, it's not very safe. You're not really going to find a lot of time to just stand in front of a boss and safely DPS, as most things will just, again, just kill you if you stand in front of them or cancel you out of abilities, etc. Generally not recommended, but still viable. As for 100 equipment, you can absolutely use whatever you want. He's very, very flexible, doesn't really specialize in any one thing. However, I will say Crossroads does get honorable mention, as it is actually surprisingly effective. And Crossroads is really good because Heavenly Vajra, this lightning cloud, it's not just the finisher that gets affected by Crossroads shoes, but also these little passive sword bolts, and these do an incredible amount of DPS already, and increasing the damage of this with Talisman shoes is going to up your DPS a fair amount. And that's quite good. And of course, in slot 2, you can use things like Indra Net. You can, of course, use Ground Quaker, although it's going to have way too low of a cooldown. But it can be useful. You can use things like Glacial Wave. Hell, you could even use Magma Wave in slot 2 if you so prefer. All really good. But again, he is very flexible. You can absolutely use any Mythic, any setup, 5-3-3, or a mixed setup, etc. Whatever you want. And that's about it. To recap, Asura is an incredibly versatile all-rounder with plenty of utility. His straightforward kit flows incredibly well together, especially with the changes from his renewal, and honestly makes him very, very enjoyable to play. So if any of this piques your interest, please give him a try. I think you'll actually enjoy him, especially with his changes. If you have any questions regarding this class, please drop a comment below. You can also join my Discord server, which I'll leave a link to below as well. You can also catch me live on Twitch if you'd like to ask me anything directly. I stream Sundays to Thursdays, generally around 5 p.m. Pacific, so I hope to see you there. Otherwise, have a good one. Cheers, guys.